Today's journey moves against time, tracing a single tradition across its lifespan in reverse. The Karla Caves represent one of the largest and most complete Chaitya halls in India. From a moment when early Buddhist rock-cut architecture had reached full development. Then we step back to its beginning. At the Bhaja Caves, we will find one of the earliest surviving rock-cut Chaitya halls in India. Two sites, close in distance, but positioned at opposite ends of the same cultural phase. One marking its maturity, the other its emergence. Our driver has taken us as far as the road allows. From here, we continue the oldest way, on foot, a climb of around 20 minutes. In the past, this approach would have been rougher, less defined, more isolated. And yet, it stood beside one of the most important trade routes in Western India, a corridor shaped by constant movement. Today, that presence looks different. Shops line the path, positioning themselves where the movement already is. Instead of goods traveling to civilization, civilization comes to them. As people, we are still drawn toward opportunity, connection, survival, belief and exchange, a reminder that while systems evolve, the fundamental instincts shaping human behavior remain unchanged. We are the same people, moving for a different version of the same world. It's easy to focus on the architecture, the stone, the shapes, the things that don't move. But to look at these places without imagining how people once lived within them is an incomplete picture. For instance, how would they have travelled? We arrived here by car, crossing the distance from the coast in only a few hours. In the past, this journey would have been made in caravans, organised groups of merchants, assistants and labourers moving together with pack animals carrying goods like spices, textiles, metals, semi-precious stones, even Roman imports, flowing between the coast and the interior. Places like Karla Caves existed within that flow, not as final destinations, but as stopping points along much longer journeys. Places to rest, to pause, to engage in religious life. But arrival here was not just practical, it was social. Travellers would often recognise people from previous journeys, exchanging information, reinforcing relationships, and recognising shared identities. In this way, these sites were not simply places to pass through, but a space where recognition, trust, and familiarity accumulated, allowing people from different regions to become part of a connected world without ever settling in one place. Another way to see this connection is through inscriptions, as we saw at Karla Caves yesterday, and as we'll see again here at Karla. These rock-cut spaces preserve records in early Brahmi script, documenting donations with remarkable consistency. The same merchant groups and regions appear again and again, supporting not just one location, but multiple sites along the same routes. Having your name recorded at multiple major sites reinforced identity and reputation, placing individuals within a visible shared landscape of movement and exchange. And most practically, supporting monasteries helped ensure access to shelter, water, and food alongside a network of familiar contacts. While many inscriptions recalled individuals, they were often closely tied to wider communities, especially professional groups known as guilds. In ancient India, a guild, known as a shreni, was an organized group of people who shared the same profession. Joining wasn't automatic. It usually involved training within the trade, often through family or apprenticeship, followed by acceptance into the group. Once inside, members were expected to follow shared standards and uphold the guild's reputation. A person's identity and trustworthiness were closely linked to that collective. A traveller might not know another individual personally, but recognizing their guild meant understanding who they were, where they came from, and whether they could be trusted. At Karla, some of the pillar inscriptions record donations by Yavanas. The term referred to Greeks, people connected to the Hellenistic world that spread east after Alexander the Great's campaigns. Yavanas were not simply foreign visitors. They were likely long-settled communities or individuals of Greek descent, fully integrated into Indian society. They used local languages, participated in regional trade networks, and contributed to Buddhist religious life alongside other donors. Which means the path we're walking now was not just local. It was part of a wider cosmopolitan world where people, goods, and ideas moved across regions, cultures, and identities, connecting Western India to a much larger world beyond. We've almost made it to the top. Let's imagine we are traders, arriving here after the climb. First we would pause, setting down goods, taking water, letting the movement of the journey slow. Around us, others would be doing the same, resting, speaking, preparing for what comes next. Then a different presence. Figures in robes would have moved through the space with quiet purpose. Monks, maintaining the site, continuing their routines, not separate from the world we've come from, but part of the same system, shaped by the same movement. And unlike us, many of them would have remained here, living in these spaces carved directly into the rock. As travellers, we would have been guests. We wouldn't have slept inside the caves themselves, but out here, on the open ground, close to our goods and animals. But before moving on, we would have turned to the religious space. The great Chaitya Hall, just ahead, the largest of its kind to survive in India. Not all of us would have been Buddhist. Participation didn't require it. It was part of the environment, a way of engaging with the people, the place, and the network we were moving through. Religious life here was not fixed or exclusive. It was fluid, overlapping, allowing travellers to take part as they passed through. Only now, as we stand before it, does its true scale begin to register. A pinnacle of the rock-cut Chaitya Hall tradition, dated to around the 1st century CE. We're inside the veranda, the entrance before the entrance, a space just as important as the interior. Unlike the Karla cave of the previous episode, where details like this reflected later traditions layered onto earlier structures, the carvings here are largely original. This isn't a space built up over centuries. You're seeing a moment where structure, sculpture, and symbolism were planned as one. This matters because many people expect early Buddhist sites to be simple. Karla shows something different. Early Buddhist spaces could be grand, highly decorated, and deeply connected to the social world that created them. Because this architecture was already highly refined and finished, it made later alterations difficult without disrupting the original design. That being said, there are some Buddhas, such as these, which were added centuries later. This great horseshoe-shaped arch above the entrance here served both a practical and symbolic role. It became one of the defining elements of Buddhist Chaitya design, known as the Gavaksha. The design first appeared earlier at sites like Bhaja Caves, the site we will see later in this episode. But here at Karla Caves, it was developed into something far more refined and monumental. We can see Gavakshas all around, here, and here, a style adopted as decoration as much as purpose, a form that gradually evolved into a symbol of spiritual opening. We step inside. The Great Chaitya is not just large, it is designed to feel larger than expected. The narrow entrance opens into sudden expansion. At the end of the hall, the Stupa emerges. It is a common misinterpretation to refer to this space as a temple, and that's not quite accurate, even if it feels like one. It is centered on a stupa, not an idol, and that is what defines it as a Chaitya hall, a space designed for procession and circumambulation around it, the most powerful object of early Buddhist devotion. Remember, nothing made of stone here was added. Everything you see was carved from a single mass of mountain rock, cut top down using iron chisels rather than assembled piece by piece. Even the stupa was carved, not placed. The ceiling was shaped before the floor was finished. Pillars were left in place as the surrounding rock was removed. Any mistake was permanent. There was no fixing a miscut. One of the most important details at Karla is the use of wooden ribs in the ceiling. In fact, some of these beams are thought to be ancient, not restored. The earliest Buddhist worship halls were built in timber. Recreating that form in stone preserves a direct connection to the past. It signals that this space belongs to a lineage, not just a place. The hall has 15 large pillars on each side of the nave. Their elaborate capitals carry human figures and animals, like the entrance we just passed through. Real-world symbolism, not enlightened deities. Elephants kneel, often carrying human figures. They signal strength, abundance, royal authority, and prosperity. And like outside, there are couples, often called Mithuna figures. They represent fertility, prosperity, beauty, good fortune, and social flourishing. The stupa is the sacred focus, but the path towards it is lined with a visual language drawn from the natural world. Although most painting at Karla has disappeared, faint traces survive, including this painted image of a later Buddha figure inside the complex. This is significant because it reminds us that the caves were never originally experienced as bare stone alone. Here are some of the inscriptions we were talking about earlier. Karla contains more than 30 of them, mostly written in Brahmi script and the Prakrit language, Brahmi being the writing system itself, and Prakrit, the spoken language being recorded. It's worth noting that although the hall feels perfectly symmetrical, minor irregularities exist in spacing. This suggests the builders worked by eye, rather than strict measurement.
कितनी? कितनी? कितने? कितने? कितने का है? अरे प्राइस कितनी?
My name is Shoaib. My name is DSG. Chocolate boy. My name is Kartik. Cute boy. Hello guys. Hey, DSG man, I love it. It's Indian gang. You have YouTube channel?
So, we've paid our respects to the Chaitya Hall. As traders, we've slept, rested, eaten, and taken water. We are ready to move on. We might continue to the next resting point along the route, but more often we would pass our goods onward, turning back the way we came to collect more, repeating the same stretch again and again, because this wasn't a single journey, it was a chain. The traders we would have handed our goods to would specialize in the next section, just as we specialize in ours. Sometimes we would sell the goods onward, the profit increasing along the way at each step. Other times, partnerships would carry the goods further, with profits shared at the end of the journey. Payment from this might have been received here from a previous shipment, or later at major hubs and ports. All of this relied on trust, reinforced by merchant and artisan guilds, which regulated pricing, obligations, and reputation, allowing goods to pass through many hands without constant negotiation. At the deepest level, Karla is a snapshot, a world where religion was tied to movement rather than fixed sacred centers, where trade routes shaped sacred geography, where monasteries functioned not only as religious spaces, but as social and economic hubs, where architecture was carved directly into living rock rather than assembled from stone blocks, and where cultural boundaries were far more fluid than what we imagine today. Karla is not just ancient, it represents a fundamentally different way of organizing society itself. Like Kanheri, Buddhism eventually faded from this site. Today, active worship is Hindu, centered around the modern temple we saw just outside the caves, the shrine of Ekvira Devi, a revered goddess worshipped as a form of Durga, who we've encountered before, and who remains deeply important to local communities. The Great Chaitya Hall itself represents the high point of a tradition that did not continue indefinitely. Over time, Chaitya halls became less central. Image-based worship expanded. Structural temples increasingly came to dominate sacred architecture. Karla, therefore, stands near the peak of a tradition that would eventually fade. But first, let's head to where it began, back to an earlier world, when Chaitya halls were first emerging in stone. Again, we find ourselves at the base of a mountain, the start of another climb towards an ancient cave system, the Bhaja Caves. And again, we arrived with the luxury of modern transport, when in the past, travellers would have walked here from Karla several hours through the hills and passes of the Western Ghats. The Chaitya Hall we will find at the top is dated to around the 2nd century BC, roughly 300 years older than Karla. It is considered one of the earliest surviving examples of its architectural type in Western India, predated only by a handful of sites. But what existed before this, before Chaitya halls were carved into rock? In the centuries after the Buddha, worship centered primarily around open-air stupas, relic mounds that predated enclosed spaces for congregational worship. As Buddhist communities became more settled, wooden monasteries and early Chaitya halls began to emerge, creating sheltered spaces for teaching, ritual, and collective gathering around stupas. Not only was timber construction far easier than carving directly into rock, but the stupas themselves were still relatively simple structures, often earthen mounds or brick-built monuments, rather than the monumental stone forms seen later in Buddhist architecture. Over time, several things changed simultaneously. Monastic life became increasingly permanent. Trade networks expanded through the Western Ghats, bringing sustained wealth, movement, and patronage. Regional powers, local chiefs, and later dynasties, such as the Satavahana dynasty, became increasingly connected to Buddhist institutions developing along these routes. and carving techniques improved enough to make large rock-cut interiors feasible. At sites like Bhaja Caves, these developments came together. The rock-cut Chaitya hall was still closely imitating the wooden architecture it was familiar with. But now it was permanent, repeatable, and tied to long-term monastic institutions, supported by wider economic and political networks. And Bhaja was not alone. Other cave monasteries were beginning to appear along the same trade corridors through western India, gradually forming a connected landscape of Buddhist activity. Without sites like Bhaja, it would be far harder to explain how Chaitya halls developed, or what early Buddhist monastic spaces may actually have looked like. Because the original wooden structures themselves have not survived, and later sites, such as Karla, would give us a distorted picture, too refined, too complete, too evolved. And yet, for all their differences, the similarities between Karla and Bhaja should not be ignored, because both were shaped by the same early Buddhist systems that connected Western India across centuries. At both sites, monastic life changed with the seasons. During the dry months, many monks travelled across wider regions, while the monsoon retreat brought larger communities of monks back together within the caves. This would have been the busiest period of the year, although places like Karla and Bhaja were probably never entirely unoccupied. The movement of traders was deeply entwined with these same seasonal rhythms. During the monsoon, routes became far more dangerous as heavy rains turned paths muddy and unstable. Rivers swelled, and mountain passes became difficult to cross. But the monsoon was not simply a burden. It helped sustain the rhythm that became the heartbeat of ancient India. Seasonal winds powered long-distance maritime trade across the Indian Ocean, allowing ships to travel more predictably between Western India, Arabia, East Africa, and beyond, feeding the wider trade systems that routes like these depended upon. We have reached the top. The caves lie just beyond this gate. Soon, the Chaitya hall will appear before us, and by now, its form should feel familiar. Above, we find a design already seen at Karla Caves, the Gavaksha. Like Karla's great Chaitya, the arch here still frames a real opening, preserving the memory of earlier wooden architecture. But already, across the facade, smaller Gavaksha motifs appear purely as decoration. We are witnessing a transition before our eyes. What began as part of a practical system was gradually becoming a sacred decorative language in its own right. Again, we see a barrel-vaulted roof lined with timber beams. Unlike Karla, none here are believed to be original, but later restorations. By restoring the wood that time erased, the caves continue their dialogue with the past, just as those who created these halls once intended. The stupa here is smooth, the result of several factors, but ritual activity likely played a role as well. Generations of human presence, movement, and touch may have gradually polished parts of the surface over time, leaving behind a physical trace of long human devotion. These columns lean slightly inward, a detail often interpreted as the continuation of an earlier timber building technique where inward tilting helped support the structure. Stone architecture no longer needed to behave this way, and somewhere between Bhaja and Karla, the columns were straightened. Notice their simplicity, plain octagonal shafts with no elaborate capitals. At Bhaja, none of that existed yet. The builders were still thinking like carpenters, not yet like stone architects. Unlike Karla, these Viharas are accessible for us to explore today. Notice how this section imitates wooden railings. Like most Viharas of early Buddhism, they were practical, disciplined, and repetitive, in design. Some of these viharas are thought to be among the oldest rock-cut caves in western India. Notice this carving here. Even after centuries of erosion, we can still recognize a human figure carved into the stone. Its exact identity is uncertain now, perhaps a guardian, musician, dancer, or warrior. But it reminds us that these caves were once far more visually alive than they appear today. These were not primitive caves. They are old, simple in appearance, but not unsophisticated. They rise across multiple levels. Their orientation towards the sun appears deliberate rather than accidental. And decoration, although restrained and not yet narrative in the way later Buddhist sites would become, is still present. Down here, we can see a later addition to the site, a stone shivling associated with Hindu worship. This is important because it shows the site continued to be used long after its original excavation. It was not simply carved and abandoned. Communities returned here for centuries. Here we see stone beds where monks would have slept, simple rooms for rest and little else. The stone platforms were likely covered with simple mats, cloth bedding, blankets, or cushions made from perishable materials such as cotton, woven reeds, grass, or animal skins. We can see here where a section of the floor has fallen away. The original access point to these caves no longer survives. Here, even more rooms, places to sleep, meditate, and shelter during the monsoon months. If you look closely at Bhaja's walls and ceilings, you can see chisel marks, millions of chips caused by human hands striking stone with tools. But we should not imagine the site exactly as it appears today. Bhaja was most likely once coloured, plastered, decorated, and combined with wooden structures that no longer survive. Much like Karla and Kanheri, the sites we explored yesterday, this place was never truly discovered because it was never truly lost. There was never a period when it ceased to be used, visited, or remembered. We have already seen evidence of that here through the presence of the Shivling. This is remarkable in itself, because many historic places survive only because they were forgotten. Once abandoned, they disappear from human attention long enough to escape destruction, rebuilding, quarrying, or reuse. Tomorrow, at Ajanta, we will see an example of this. A site that fell into relative isolation for centuries, helping preserve some of the most extraordinary surviving paintings in the ancient world. Bhaja survived differently. It endured through continuous human presence across different religions, cultures, and centuries. Now, let's imagine these spaces as they would have been during a monsoon retreat more than 2,000 years ago, this time from a monk's perspective. When vassa commenced, a period of almost constant rainfall, the Western Ghats transformed into a landscape of mist, waterfalls, mud, and dense green vegetation. Powerful downfalls could arrive suddenly and last for hours, sometimes so heavily that conversation became difficult beneath the sound of rain striking stone. The air would have been cool and damp, wind moving through entrances, sandals scraping stone floors, quiet conversations in Prakrit, chanting from the Chaitya hall, carrying faintly through the complex. Privacy would have been limited. These were communal religious spaces, not individual homes. Some cells may have used cloth partitions or hanging coverings for modesty or warmth, although very little organic material survives to prove exactly how interiors were arranged. At night, oil lamps would have provided small pools of flickering light inside certain areas. We can still see blackened sections today on some ceilings and walls, likely caused by long-term lamp usage. Some caves may have held stored goods, water jars, tools, manuscripts, or offerings. Meals were simple, but food would still have been prepared and shared collectively, often supported through donations connected to the trade routes below. Traders would arrive from time to time, seeking shelter from the rains, resting here briefly alongside the monks before continuing their journeys. And perhaps most importantly, Bhaja would not have felt ancient to the people living here. It would have felt alive, functional, important. When it came to passing time, a monk's life here would have been structured around repetition, discipline, and communal routine. Senior monks instructed younger novices, discussed doctrine, debated interpretations, and memorized large bodies of oral tradition. In early Buddhism, memorization was crucial. Entire teachings could be preserved through collective recitation in an age before widespread written manuscripts. Hours may have been spent each day chanting teachings aloud within these halls. At other times, monks would have cleared caves, maintained lamps, collected and stored water, repaired clothing, prepared simple meals, cared for guests or traveling monks, and maintained the wider monastic complex itself. But despite the spiritual atmosphere, these were still human communities. People talked, shared stories from journeys, discussed politics, trade routes, kings, famines, weather, and news arriving from distant regions through travelling merchants. Here we find a rare example of an inscription at Bhaja. Unlike later cave complexes, where donor inscriptions became increasingly formalized and widespread, Bhaja preserves relatively little written evidence. And yet, even this faint carving reminds us that these caves were not anonymous spaces. Real people passed through here, leaving fragments of themselves behind in the stone. Here, we encounter something different. A group of 14 rock-cut stupas standing together beside the monastery. These are not ordinary architectural features. They are memorial stupas connected to monks and teachers associated with Bhaja itself. In Buddhist tradition, stupas were not only symbols of the Buddha, but could also commemorate important religious figures after death. Some may once have contained relics, ashes, or other funerary remains connected to the individuals they honoured. Several inscriptions survive here, preserving the names of elders once connected to this monastery. And this changes how we see Bhaja. Until now, it is easy to think of these caves as archaeology. Anonymous stone structures surviving from a distant age, even after trying to imagine the people who once lived within them. But here, individuals emerge from the rock itself. Real monks who once lived here, taught here, died here. And more than 2,000 years later, fragments of their names still survive. Like everything else at Bhaja, these stupas were not constructed and placed here. They were carved directly from the living rock itself. If you look towards the back, you can see how the excavation was gradually pushed deeper into the hillside as additional stupas were created over time. You might be wondering what these square structures above the stupas are, something we've now been seeing across the past 2 episodes. It is known as the Harmika, and once again, its origins reach back further than rock-cut architecture. As we know, stupas were once burial mounds, raised over relics or important individuals. And these mounds were often enclosed by wooden railings, separating ritually protected space from the ordinary world. Over time, as stupas evolved from burial monuments into increasingly symbolic sacred structures, so too did their enclosures. Here, the railing that once surrounded the mound has itself been symbolically elevated above it in the form of the Harmika. In this final section, we encounter some of the earliest surviving carvings at Bhaja, a rare glimpse into Buddhist visual culture before later artistic traditions fully developed. One famous relief here has often been identified as Surya, the solar deity riding in a chariot alongside Indra riding the elephant Airavata. Other scholars have connected these scenes to Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, or to mythological and symbolic forces connected to Mara and the spiritual struggles surrounding enlightenment. Part of what makes these carvings so fascinating is precisely this ambiguity. We are looking at Buddhist art from a period when imagery was still evolving, before the Buddha himself was commonly represented in human form. This concludes today's episode of Ancient India. Over the course of this episode, we moved between two different moments within the same architectural tradition. At Karla, we stood inside one of the great achievements of early Buddhist rock-cut architecture. And here, at Bhaja, we stepped back towards an earlier world where these spaces felt closer to their wooden origins. And now, with these caves behind us, it is time to move deeper into India, where the story changes again. Tomorrow begins much earlier. We leave Mumbai before dawn, waking up at 3 a.m. to fly east towards Aurangabad, gateway to two of the most extraordinary cave complexes in the world. Our next destination is Ajanta. Unlike Karla and Bhaja, Ajanta belongs largely to a later phase of Buddhist cave architecture, from a period when cave shrines increasingly became centered around the Buddha himself. Above all else, Ajanta is famous for something incredibly rare. Entire surviving worlds of ancient color still clinging to cave walls more than 1,000 years later. This will become one of the most important places we visit on our entire journey through ancient India.